Hopefully that got your attention. I think I'm on. All right, we're going to get started. This is a few minutes past 9:30. Good morning, everybody. My name is Erin Washington. On behalf of the whole Allied Fourth team and the Christian Education Committee, we're so happy to welcome you to our first session of Wonderfully Made, a reexamination of Scripture and LGBTQ+ people. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to learn together about what it means to identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community with guest speakers from the Queer Wellness Center and 864 Pride. And we're going to be looking together at two books, Unclobber by Colby Martin and Transforming by Austin Hartke. And as we've said many times now, this class is for those who are excited about discussing these things at church, and for those who feel a little more tentative and doubtful. Everybody is welcome here in this space. So to help create a welcoming and safe space, I'd like to discuss the format of our class. So this is going to be more of a lecture style than a discussion-based format. When you have a question or a thought, you can see the papers that are on your table. So just go ahead and write it down. We have a basket over there at that table. So if you'll please put your questions with your names and put them in the basket on the way out, then we'll be able to address those as we go. The other way that you can do this is you can submit an email to Pastor Mike, like if you think of something during the week that you want to ask about, that you're thinking about, you can go ahead and send him an email. But whatever way you submit, please put your name. The only way that we can grow as a community together is when we're willing to be brave and vulnerable and own the words that we say. And then to discuss the questions, we're going to have two options. So first, Mike is going to be available most Sundays back here in the fellowship hall, starting on October 9th. So he's not available today, but starting on October 9th, and we'll announce like which Sundays each time that he'll be available. He'll be able for discussion if you want to just come by for a chat. And then the second thing that we're going to do is at the conclusion of the series, we're going to have what we're calling a clunky questions luncheon. We've scheduled one Sunday following the end of the class, but we may end up having another as well to give everyone the opportunity to come. And that's a place where we can debrief together as a group, so like a smaller group. Last, let me talk briefly about our community guidelines for these sessions, which are adapted from the ones that are used by Just Faith, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. So here's the first one. Be fully present with your doubts, fears, failings, and convictions, joys, and successes. Listen intently in order to fully understand different points of view. Honor the space between no longer and not yet. When the going gets tough, turn to wonder. This is the second one. If you feel judgmental or defensive, ask yourself, I wonder what my reaction teaches me about myself. Set aside judgment to listen to others and to yourself more deeply. Third one, attend your own inner teacher. So we learn from prayer, readings, questions, silence, and people both inside and outside of our community. So pay close attention to your own reactions and responses, which are your most important teacher. And finally, know that it is possible to leave a meeting of our community with whatever it was that you needed when you arrived, and that the seeds planted here can keep growing in the days ahead. Okay, so we're pretty good at group responses as Presbyterians, right? So I'm going to ask all of you to respond, I will, to this question. As participants in this class, will you agree to abide by our community guidelines? I will. Okay. Thank you. Okay, now I would like to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Smith Evener. Smitty is an evaluation scientist, bioinformaticist, and registered nurse. He is the scientific director of the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, a partnership of the FDA and NIH. Smitty is a nationally recognized expert in LGBTQ+ health disparities, implementation science, and stakeholder engagement. So we're so thankful that Smitty is here to present our first session with Leah.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all for welcoming me. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces in the audience. I know one of the sons of your congregation, David Randolph, and I have several connections, but it's been wonderful to watch the community grow over the years. The other piece of my background that wasn't in that bio is still remain an active ELCA leader. So we are brothers and sisters through covenant, through communion, and it's wonderful to be here in a faith community that is so similar to the ones in which I grew up. In the ELCA, we spent the early 2000s having some of these same discussions. You may have heard about some of them. You may be familiar with our 2009 churchwide assembly decision in which we decided to make room for same-sex relationships to be blessed by the church and for pastors who are in same-sex relationships to continue to serve. Those were very difficult, very painful conversations, regardless of where we stand on these issues, where we were brought up, where we are in our current journey of acceptance and deconstruction of the faith that has sometimes been used against other people, but has always been such a source of nourishment for us. It is very hard to engage in this. I greatly appreciate these community guidelines. It is really important to approach this with curiosity and to be open to exploring the thoughts and meanings behind what you're thinking about. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the historical context for why this conversation is needed, some of the context of what would have been known in Jesus's time, and what would have been known by those who wrote the Bible. The reality is that when we talk about homosexuality, this is a modern construct. In biblical times, there was no such thing as a marriage that was solely built on mutual love and respect. Marriages were transactions. This was women were bought and sold with livestock, with properties to advance the family. There are different ways of viewing that. We can have a whole other conversation about what that means for women's rights that maybe is not the purpose of our conversation today. One of the things my friend mentioned, I do have a tendency to speak very, very quickly. If I start moving too fast, just give me a hand signal and I will slow down. I'm a pastor's kid, so I get a little bit excited. But I also have that ADHD going, and I had coffee this morning. So it's likely that I might want to run away tangent. And if I get too much on a soapbox, don't be afraid to encourage me just to settle down just a little bit. But what we want to talk about, the reality is that the word homosexuality didn't exist until the 1860s. This was coined in a pamphlet that was being circulated in opposition to an anti-sodomy law that was being instituted in the Prussian Empire. And this was the first time we saw this idea of an individual's sexuality being relevant. Prior to the 1800s, we didn't think about people's sexualities. In the biblical times, we wouldn't have thought about someone's sexuality. People had sexual behaviors, they had sexual relationships, and then they had a marriage that was intended to further the family line. There's a lot of purity laws around that, but often disadvantaged women and excuse the behaviors of men. That's a whole other conversation and one that I love to talk about. So if you want, I can get my soapbox out of the parking lot and we can talk about it later. But this is a really bold claim, right? Like, for some of you, this might be the first time you've heard this and you're thinking, how in the heck does this guy know what he's talking about? There's a couple different sources of evidence for why we can understand that the concepts of queer individuals are not new. The first that I would draw on is burial sites. This photograph is from a grave discovered in 2011 in the Czech Republic. The skeleton buried here was identified as male. The way archaeologists and anthropologists do that is based on the shape of the pelvis bone. Now, there is the valid critique that that's not a perfect method. Just like everything else in science, there is the possibility of error. Accuracy of determining pelvic bone gender or sex is about 90%. But this is not the only example. This is just one example. In this example, a skeleton that was determined to be male through forensic assessment was buried in the customs associated with females. So the skeleton is facing east instead of west, whereas men would face west when they were buried. And the skeleton was buried with jugs and pots instead of being buried with knives and tools as other men in that culture were buried. This is dated to about just under 3,000 years ago, so 9 to 500 BC. This is not the only example that we have of this. There are examples of burials that do not align with how we would gender the skeleton based on our current methodology. And I'm going to talk about several other cultures where we have more documented evidence of an acknowledgement of third genders, of different sexualities, of different ideas of how individuals are outside of their biology. We also have some very, very clear records. This is purported to be the oldest gay couple that is documented. I'm not going to pretend that I know how to pronounce those names. If there are already Egyptologists in the class, I would welcome, I do know the new ones that. But the second one I have heard hundreds of times and I can never get it right. I'm not going to attempt it. These two were royal servants during the 5th dynasty of Egypt. So this is about 25th century BC. They were essentially the managers of the royal manicurists. So these were high court officials. They were deeply ingrained in all levels of leadership. And as such, they were buried with honors. They were buried with other servants around them. They were buried with treasures and depictions of their lives and their children in their tomb. And this image here, this is how husbands and wives are typically displayed in imagery in tombs, facing each other, nose to nose, in an intimate embrace. We also have other documentation, other corroboration that this was a same-sex couple. Now, they both had wives, and they both had children with those wives, but they had a very deep and intimate relationship with one another, so even intimate that they were buried together. We also know in ancient Greece, it is, any of us that have done any reading know that sexuality was just viewed very differently by the ancient Greeks. Plato's Symposium, famously, those men who are halves of men, yet loving other men become the most manly. The Sacred Band of Thebes was a military force that was built entirely on same-sex couples, based on the idea that they would fight fiercely to defend the one they loved. We also know that Alexander the Great was, by our modern conceptions, gay, had many male lovers, also had many female lovers to propagate his line, but those he shared the most intimate circles with were all men. Now, all of this context, we think, okay, great, but these are all hundreds and thousands of years before Jesus, right? What does that mean? Jesus may or may not have been aware of this context. We don't fully know how highly educated Jesus was. We know he was literate, we know he had some level of education. But those that wrote the Bible in the decades and centuries that followed Jesus' life almost certainly knew about the lives of these people. This was a culture that was dominated by Greek life, by Greek thoughts. They would have been familiar with Plato. They would have read these texts about same-sex relationships. This was known. These were not secrets. It is modern history that tries to draw a curtain over this and talk about Abraham Lincoln's friend that he spent most of his life with and shared a bed. Oh, they were just friends. Emily Dickinson's friends, her longtime friend whom she lived with. It is a modern idea that we should be ashamed of these relationships and ashamed of these ideas. There are many examples from other cultures around the world where not only is it acknowledged that other genders exist, that other sexualities exist, but they're actually elevated. The Kugari and the Galartar were transgender clergy in early Mesopotamia. Now, this is a many thousands of years before Jesus' time. This is the religion that they practiced predates Judaism even. But it was transgender people who were considered to be priests of that religion. Some of them would change their bodies, but most of them simply changed the way they dressed. You also have the Kinar, which is a third gender in Hindu, which they're considered to be holy beings. And this is still a modern concept that is honored in many parts of India today, where people who identify as a gender that does not align with the sex they're assigned at birth or their parent sex assigned at birth are considered to be touched and blessed by God. You have an Anshoku, which was a set of samurai warriors in pre-Meiji Japan. That basically just means before the 1800s, which is when the Westerners came in and a lot of cultural shifts happened in Japan. But prior to that, this was an honored group of warriors, and it was their love and relationship with each other that was considered to make them so important, so righteous, and that they weren't distracted by otherworldly possessions, and it was their love for each other that kept them going as warriors. We then also have two-spirit, which may be something that some of you are somewhat more familiar with, this idea that we see documented in many Native American cultures, where they recognize someone who falls outside of the traditional concepts of what men and women are, and are frequently, again, elevated to the level of shamans. The picture here is some of the Kinar, modern faith leaders and holy people, and in some places considered shamans as miracle workers. I've thrown a lot of information at you, right? And so some of you may be wondering, okay, so what? My point is that this idea that homosexuality is something we need to be ashamed of is new. This is not something that Jesus or the writers of the Bible were concerned with. They were concerned about other things. I'm going to touch on some of those in a minute. But the word homosexuality doesn't actually appear in prints of the Bible until the 1960s. Somewhere in this church, I'm sure you have an old King James version or an old RSV, and you can look and compare the different translation between those texts. Because I did make an assumption coming in here, assuming Presbyterians also hear and know and recognize that the Bible was not written in English. It is something I have done in the past. But as ecclesiastical communities, this is something that we recognize and we honor. We know these languages have context that doesn't always cross into our modern world. We talk about needing to read the Bible through the hermeneutic, through the lens of the people who wrote it and the people who were reading it. So if we can look at some of the other passages. For example, one that's frequently quoted is Leviticus, man shall not lie with man as he does with women, that is an abomination. That's pretty clear, right? It's kind of hard to argue with what that says. But we have to look at the context. If you look at the verses in front of it and after it, there's also rules about shrimp, rules about how you groom yourself, rules about clothes we wear. I wager that at least 75% of us in this room are in violation of Leviticus law. We can go around and check people's tags if we need to prove it. That's probably the easiest way if you're wearing a poly cleanse, which most of our socks probably are. That's a violation of Leviticus law. And there is no severity. The word that's translated to abomination is used for many of the other things that are outlawed in Leviticus law. It is a modern conceptualization of trying to elevate this one issue to being such a much bigger issue. There's a whole long conversation to have about Leviticus. And you'll touch on them over the next couple of weeks. They're covered in books that you're going to be reading, but I always think of it as this is a set of rules designed to keep the people alive in the desert. And what is one thing that you really need to keep people alive? Children. Right? So if nothing else, we can think of it in the context of these are rules to keep people healthy and to keep them patient. The other, we know that there are relationships in the Bible that do not conform to the standards that we, in our modern interpretation, seem to require. The story that I frequently point to that is probably the most obvious because it's two men. There are stories of two women, but we know the Bible doesn't always do a good job of telling women's stories. Even less so after it gets through the hands of all the white men in the 18 and 1900s who adjusted with the translation. But Jonathan and David, son of Saul. In 1 Samuel, it says the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. The language that is used to describe their relationship is very, very similar to the language used to describe marriages. Throughout the books of Samuel, we see that both David and Jonathan take wives and have children, but their relationship continues to be a focal point of the story. And there are, in fact, 6 passages that at least, I'm going to point to Susan Ackerman as one biblical expert, 6 passages that she points to as eroticized is the word that she used. But there's even a passage in which Saul berates David for forsaking the comfort of women in favor of the love of Jonathan. There's pretty clear indications that there's something special about this relationship. And even though there is some exploration of Saul's difficulty and frustration with David maybe not furthering the family line as quickly as he wanted, the whole context of the story is a celebration of these two heroes. Jonathan and David were leaders of the military. You can read this story through a different lens and interpret it as Jonathan subjugating himself to David's higher claim to the throne. But many more scholars would agree that there's something about this relationship that the writer of Samuel thought was important for us to hear about. And it may be what it means to be committed to another. It may be what it means, to serve. There are lots and lots of ways to interpret them. And in the end, David's song of the bow is a lament for the loss of Jonathan and for Saul. As I said, there are plenty of other examples. There are some ways of reading about the daughters of Jacob, Leah and Rachel, in which their relationship is talked about in a different way. The wives of Jacob, not the daughters. This relationship is talked about in a different way than many other relationships between two women are talked about. Some of you will remember the red tent, which explored some of that, maybe not as deeply as we could today, given our additional context. There's also Leah's daughter, Diana, who leaves to seek the company of women, we're told. There are plenty of other stories we can look at in the Bible. One that's often brought up is Sodom and Gomorrah, whereas modern readings would see this as a condemnation of gay people. What most historians will say, most experts will say, is that cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were condemned because of their lack of hospitality, because they wanted to abuse the angels that visited. Lot is a righteous man, not because he wasn't a sexual pervert, but because he defended the guests. Those of you that remember the story, when the mob comes to his house and asks for the angels, what does he do? He offers his daughters. It is the context of these verses that help us understand the Bible does not talk or does not condemn those that are different. The Bible condemns abusers. The Bible condemns those who are violent. And we have to read it with a lot of context. Otherwise, we look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we think, oh, it's okay for my daughters to be raped as long as they protect the guests, instead of understanding that these daughters were property that Lot could use to defend these visitors and these guests. The other story that I point to is the Ethiopian eunuch. In Acts 8, verses 26 to 40. Do you all remember the story? Philip is traveling and he comes across a chariot and he hears the book of Isaiah being read, the prophet Isaiah. He gets in the chariot and starts teaching this eunuch. Now we are told this eunuch is a member of the court. So in all likelihood, this is a literal eunuch. This is someone who has been castrated. But even in that interpretation, this is someone who has stepped outside of the role expected for someone of his sex, of his gender, changed his body in order to fulfill it. There are other places in the Bible and in other ancient texts, the word eunuch doesn't necessarily mean a literal eunuch. It could mean someone who is what we would consider today queer or transgender. But the piece that I think is so important here is towards the end of that story, the eunuch asks Philip, what is to prevent me from entering the kingdom? An important context here is under Jewish law, a eunuch is not clean and cannot enter the temple. So this is someone that the modern prevailing religious community would shun and put aside. Philip does not reinforce that shunning. Philip takes him and baptizes him. And this is one of the first stories we have after the gospel of the word being spread. So one of the earliest stories. The fact that this is included so early by the writers of the Bibles, the writers of the books of the Bible should suggest to us that the God's kingdom is for everyone. Those people, that history, that the greater world would tell us are unclean or unworthy, are the exact people that God is setting us up. The other verse that we talked about a lot is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 11. This is from the King James Version. If you pull out a modern NSV or RSV, it would read that neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals shall inherit the kingdom of God. But in this older translation, we see in parentheses two Greek words. There's malakos, which is translated as effeminate, and there's arsenokotai, which is translated as abusers of themselves and mankind. The word malakos is translated in many places to mean an effeminate man, and arsenokotai appears only twice in the Bible, and we see it nowhere else. This is a word that Paul created. And what do those words mean? Arsenokotai comes from the Greek. I did not include the rest of them up there because I knew I was pushing my luck trying to pronounce two Greek words. But it comes from the Greek words of male child and bed. And that word for bed has a sexual connotation. It's the word that's used to talk about bedding a spouse. This is not referring to a consensual relationship. This is child abuse. We see it in 1 Corinthians and we see it in 1 Timothy. Again, in a list of people who will not inherit the kingdom of God. Prior to the 1960s, we did not see this word translated as homosexual. It is abusers of themselves, mankind, fornicators, some kind of sexual pervert. And that's exactly what he's talking about. We talked about Greek life and that same-sex relationships were very common. The other thing that was very, very common and widely accepted is that when young boys would take on a mentor or an apprentice and learn a trade or a skill, they would thank that mentor, that older man, with sexual favors. And that was considered normal practice, that was considered appropriate, and that was considered the correct way to honor the gifts that you were being given, the instruction being given. I'd argue that's what we're referring to in these passages. Taking a male child, a boy, to bed. The other word is malikia, which in other areas of the Bible, it's referring to garments. In Matthew and Luke, we see it, the malakos robes, talking about how soft the robes are. one of the wealthy individuals. If we look through the entire history of how this word is used, it may be being used as a softness of touch, an intimacy of touch, and it may actually refer to masturbators. It may actually be talking about, again, another purity law that we would, by modern standards, not necessarily adhere to. We now know there are health benefits to masturbation, so why would we outlaw it, right? But these are just two examples of the ways in which our modern translations have led us to believe that there are problems with a community that isn't necessarily mentioned as directly in the Bible as we would think. Queer identities are not new. We see this throughout many cultures that are around Jesus's culture. We see this in Jesus' own culture. We see this in cultures that directly influences the writers of the Bible and the councils of Nicaea in 300 AD and the early church as they were forming and coalescing this religion. We see it in the Roman Empire when Constantine adopts Christianity. But homosexuality is not directly condemned in translations of the Bible until the 1960s. What I hope that y'all will take away from this journey together, which we are so thankful to be a part of, is that what the Bible is talking about is abuse. A consensual, affirming relationship is a direct expression of sexuality, which, according to some, and I would believe, is a spiritual gift, just like any other. And our command, our edict from God, is not to hide it, to keep it secret, to be ashamed of it, but it is to use it in ways that help others experience love. So whether that should be in a consensual, affirming relationship, not the kinds of relationships that we're talking about here in Corinthians. This is not a gift that you use to harm a child. That's what Paul is saying. I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about science. I know that's a lot. I see a lot of emotions in the room. And I really hope that people are writing down questions. The clunky question session is something that we did a lot in ELCA. And it becomes a really incredible time for people to ask the questions they feel like they need to ask, even if they don't necessarily know the best way to ask it. So please don't be shy with the questions you write down. This is something that we are here to do to provide that support. Don't be shy. If it is something that's really poorly worded, we'll also help word it a little bit better before we make it public. We're familiar with doing that. But in nature, same-sex sexual behavior is documented in over 1,500 species. There's a quote here from National Geographic. This isn't something we only see in higher mammals. We see this in insects. We see this in fish. We see this in invertebrates. This is something that is so pervasive in creation. How could God's world create the same phenomenon over and over again and it not be part of God's creation? There are a lot of different theories of why. We're still trying to understand exactly how homosexuality occurs. One prevailing theory is that it's the common ancestor for our way millions of years ago when we first started to evolve sexual behaviors. As our ancestors did, that we also had not differentiated secondary sex characteristics. So an early vertebrate or invertebrate that was first starting to evolve sexual behaviors instead of reproducing asexually, they just have not been able to differentiate. And there was never any need for this to evolve out. But that's a whole other conversation, and I could pull up all kinds of references and get a whiteboard if people really want to get into the science of it. But see a couple of eyes and basically go over. But we also know that some species have changed their sex. The clownfish, for example, if all the females die, one of the males will just change their body and become female. And this happens in many other species. This is part of God's creation. So whether we believe that God created the earth as it is, or we believe in a God that started this process of evolution, this is all around us. This isn't unique to humans. So what is sex and gender? If we remember our high school biology, we learned about XX and XY chromosomes. We learn that you're either a boy or a girl. It's not really that simple. What we have to do is separate these two concepts. There is a biological sex, which has to do with a number of characteristics, chromosomes, sex organs, and the outward appearance of the body.
They warned you about the choir. This is just the choir.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I figured there was gonna be a mass exodus. That was not gonna be the most offensive point. So I appreciate you clarifying. You know, I'm familiar with church Sunday schools. I'm glad you have such a strong choir. That's wonderful. What are we singing? What are they singing today? Is anything good? You know? Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. So apart from sex, we have gender. How many of us, when we are born, does the doctor take our blood, run a genetic test, and look to see what our 23rd chromosome actually is? Was that done to anyone? No. But the doctor looks at our body and says it's a boy or it's a girl. The reality is that our ideas of who we are, how we fit into society, are cultural, and they may or may not align with the biology that's happening inside of us. So we have a series of concepts that we use to think about this. This is one infographic, and I can make us in these slides to Maureen so she can share them with anyone who wants them. But there's sex orientation and gender identity and expression. We have our conceptualization of who we are as a human, our idea of how we fit into a role. We all, at some point in our lives, had that thought of, well, I want to do what my mom is doing to help take care of the family, or I want to do what my dad is doing to help take care of the family. And the signal we receive back is that that work is not for us, right? Anyone familiar with that? Had that experience? There's a gradient of how we think of ourselves. Some of us are very drawn to nurturing, to cooking, to cleaning, to caring for the young. But our society tells us that that is women's work. Conversely, some of us very much want to build, want to provide, want to be the strength and protection of our family unit. We're told that's men's work, that's a man's role. What we are seeing currently is people starting to understand and accept that these roles don't have to apply to all of us. I myself identify as the queer non-binary person. I assigned male at birth, but I don't necessarily agree and align with the rules that society tells me I have to fill. I'm a nurse, I am a caregiver, I love taking care of a household and children and providing. And that's not necessarily what society expects of me. I can be fiercely defensive, I can be protective, but it just doesn't resonate. And so I use he, him, and they, them pronouns as a way of expressing who I am to the world. For me, it's not a problem if someone refers to me as a man. It doesn't bother me because it's not, I don't feel far enough disconnected from that reality for it to be upsetting. There are other people for whom it is. And so when you hear someone introduce themselves with their pronouns, they're trying to get a signal for who they are and how they want to interact with the world. We also have our orientation. This is the people to whom we are attracted. And there's a lot of words. I have another talk I do about the alphabet soup, the acronym, all the labels, all the identities. The thing that I try to encourage people with all of these identities is that it doesn't matter whether you can define what it means for me to stand up here and say that I'm a queer non-binary person. What matters is that you respect that I have my identity. And then what we should be concerned about is this person safe? And just like with anyone else, is the people around them safe? That should always be something to think about. We should always be conscious of whether someone might be harmful. But it is not a result of a person's sexuality or gender identity that become harmful. Our assigned sex at birth, we think of as a binary. It really isn't. We know that people are born with ambiguous genitalia. We know that people often referred to as hermaphrodites exist. There are also a series of different configurations. Even the XX, XY is not the binary we think it is. So I think I have a slide on that. And then finally, we have expressions, how we present to the world. I still dress pretty masculine. I have a large scarf collection. I have lots of bags that I call my purses. I like my shoes. But the way I express myself to the world is through traditionally masculine clothes. I usually wear a button-up and khakis. But there are plenty of other people who see lots of celebrities who express themselves somewhat differently. Biological sex. We already established that we weren't genetically tested, we were born. The XX and XY are just the two most common configurations that we see. And we typically think of them as being female and male. But even with that configuration, you can have a sensitivity to hormones. So you can have XY chromosomes and have a body that develops as female. Because when we are conceived and the egg is fertilized, as we develop, everything develops with female by default. We all have nipples. Our sexual organs are actually inverted structures of each other. I thought about including those diagrams, but I also didn't want to make anyone faint before church. Didn't want to scandalize y'all. But there are also plenty of other options. Somewhere in this congregation, there is someone who is born with ambiguous genitalia, just statistically. It's likely true. There are also going to be people in this congregation that don't have XX and XY chromosomes. I've included some of the frequencies up here. Turner syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome are two of the more common ones. That's where you have one X or you have XXY. You can also have XYY, which doesn't have a name in and of itself. That occurs about 1 in every 1,000. The other configuration is 3 X's and a Y. And you'll notice this statistic is noted in terms of how many births, because the people with this configuration tend to have other issues, and those children tend not to survive. These seem like really rare occurrences. But if you recognize how many people there are in the world, how many people there are in Greenville, these people are all around us. They are our family members, they are our loved ones. Okay. Whatever. This is my last slide. This is another tool for us to think about how these are all continuum, how these are not clear binaries. And this is a great tool for us to look at to think about our own identity and how we express ourselves to the world. So hopefully today this has been helpful for y'all. Hopefully I didn't get too rambly on you. But the thing I really want y'all to remember as you go into the next conversation is that the word homosexual was not a word that Jesus or the writers of the Bible would have used. They would not have understood what we are talking about today about committed monogamous same-sex relationships. What they were condemning was abuse, rape, and the use of sexuality in ornate religious practices. These are not things that are consistent with how we understand the spiritual gifts of God. Thank you for your time.
Any questions? Like saying that don't be shy, like take a few moments. This was a whole lot of new information for a lot of people. Again, I know I was like 6 things. Awesome, a lot more things. But take a few moments and process it, and leave questions, leave comments. I mean, genuinely, truly want to know, because we help everybody understand. And we can't do that unless we know what your questions are. And if you think of something later, as we said, Pastor Mike. Yeah, thanks for coming. We're in baskets in the corner for putting your papers in, and we also have suggested reading and their materials from the Career Wellness Center over there too, in case you have someone who you think might be interested in looking at the services offered at the Career Wellness Center. So yeah, happy day.
That's what I was thinking.